The honourable member for Cumberland, Colchester.
Well, Madam Speaker, I'm always grateful to have the opportunity to address the House of Commons, and especially in this perhaps seminal moment in Canadian history. I didn't want to do it this way, but I did come back to my riding. I thought it important to understand very clearly what the national emergency was, and I'll come to that more in the rest of my intervention. There are many difficulties, my friends, with the invocation of the Emergencies Act, and indeed debating something which has already happened is somewhat counterproductive. However, that will be an important part of the mandatory review of the entire process as we go forward. And the two main issues, as I see them, Madam Speaker, are really boiling down to number one, how did we get here? And number two, what is the justification for the Emergencies Act? There are those of you who wish to muddy the waters as to the legal justification for using the Emergencies Act. And I do believe that there are people out there who have that very important skill set. And again, that will form part of the review as well. So the question that I think we need to start with is, how did we get here? And this is, in my mind, has been the most dismal display of leadership I have ever seen. And as many in this House have been, I've been a part of sporting teams and committees and other leadership positions in my medical community. I've served in the Royal Canadian Air Force. And one thing that is very crystal clear is that when we encounter those who do not fully agree with our position or support what we think is important, then that moment in time represents a significant opportunity for dialogue. Also, as a physician, I think the opportunity to discuss options and negotiate with patients presented itself for me, Madam Speaker, on a daily basis. And if I could be so crass as to say, this is Communications 101. Since the beginning of this pandemic, I've been shocked and appalled with respect to the language used by this Prime Minister when commenting upon those who've been vaccine hesitant. I've been concerned about vaccine hesitancy since the beginning of the pandemic, and certainly I took the opportunity to review the literature, the scientific literature on the topic of vaccine hesitancy. And there are innumerable papers, and I've had the opportunity to review them, and there was absolutely no mention of division or stigmatization or name calling. The language used in these scientific papers would more be along the lines of building relationships, building trust, and understanding the other person's position. Chris Voss, who's a famous FBI negotiator, during one particularly difficult case, he spoke through an apartment door for 6 hours with no response. 6 hours. In the end, the fugitives and the hostages emerged suddenly. The fugitives commented, and I quote, "You calmed us down. We finally believed you wouldn't go away, so we just came out." I think it's important that people know that I've been in Ottawa for the last 3 weeks since the protests began. And every day I walk to work, I realize, has been brought forward by others, I am a white man. I understand that. I've never been accosted or accused or threatened. I wear a mask. But sadly, Canadians who don't agree with the Prime Minister have been vilified, stigmatized, and name called. So let's keep that in mind, my colleagues. Even on Wednesday evening, just past, I left my office at the corner bank in Wellington and I walked all the way up to the Byward Market during the protest. And indeed, I didn't feel unsafe. Nobody even spoke to me. And my fellow Canadians, is this or was a public order emergency? Certainly, I do believe there are other avenues to deal with this situation. And certainly, as I mentioned previously, I've returned here to Nova Scotia. There is absolutely no public order emergency here. That life is going on as normal. And I think parliamentarians portraying what's going on in Ottawa as a public order emergency are a little misguided. So that this isolated issue here in Ottawa does not a national emergency make. I've heard many of Liberal colleagues talking about how dangerous or scary this
The Honourable there's absolutely no obligation of anyone to be seated and not just making noise. Well, the honourable member is calling a point of order on noise. I was speaking with the clerk and I didn't hear any noise. well, I do invite the members, if they want to have conversations, to be going into the lobbies or behind the curtains. And we will allow the honourable member to proceed. It is on... Yes, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader. Yes.
Madam Speaker, I'm not 100% sure. All I was doing was with my colleague and made reference that the official opposition feels that all they have to do is kind of click their heels and wave a wand and poof, the protesters would disappear. And I said it at a very, very low voice. I didn't think anyone could even hear it. It was more of a whisper. But if I offended people in terms of their magic...
It seems that it was loud enough to bother the colleagues that were trying to listen to the speech. So I do request that members keep as quiet as possible and respect when other people are speaking. The honourable member for Cumberland Colchester, please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And lots of words come to mind about that negative interruption, and how the member actually put his own words into his interruption, for the record, is disturbing. And you know what? It's interesting how the Liberal colleagues often talk about how dangerous or scary the protest is. I don't think any of them even walked into the protest. And indeed, when I was at Health Committee one day, Health Committee ended early because my colleagues were scared to go out in the dark. Further failures of leadership are clear. Documents have been made available to us in which the Prime Minister convened a First Minister's meeting. Its proposed agenda was to consult premiers on whether to declare this public order emergency under the Emergencies Act. The documents reveal, however, that the premier's opinions were given in confidence. However, since then, their position had been made clear. The Premier of Quebec didn't think it was beneficial. Alberta was opposed. Saskatchewan opposed. Manitoba opposed. New Brunswick opposed. Nova Scotia opposed, Prince Edward Island opposed. I could find no comments for the Yukon, the Northwest Territories, or Nunavut. 7 out of 10 premiers, Madam Speaker. If that's a consultation that's ignored, why bother have it? And as has been pointed out repeatedly, there never has been, nor will there be, any consultation from this Prime Minister or any of his government officials with the protesters. I need to repeat that to this House and to all Canadians. This Prime Minister has never spoken to any of the protesters who were there previously, and now he has decided to use and employ and access the Emergencies Act. Wow. Besides the Prime Minister's dismal approval rating, what is the emergency? And what steps have been taken before the government could have enacted the Emergencies Act that would have made this right, so that Canadians could believe that some suspension of their rights and freedoms would be appropriate? Indeed, Madam Speaker, a public order emergency is described, and I quote, as a threat to Canada's security, including acts of espionage and sabotage, foreign-influenced activities which are detrimental to Canadian interests, terrorist activities, and efforts to covertly or by violence overthrow the constitutional structure of the country. Though a lawful advocacy, protest, demonstrations, and similar activities are not included. And I think I made it clear that walking through the protest, I did not feel unsafe. This public order emergency has given the federal government significant overreach with respect to potentially accessing bank accounts of not only those involved in the civil disobedience, but those who may have donated to the cause. As we've heard before, does that mean if you donated $5 or $10, your assets will be frozen? What about if, say, a relative of a leader of a party in this House donated to the cause? Would their assets be frozen? I wonder. Bloomberg News described it that banks would be required to report relationships with people involved in blockades and would be given the authority to freeze accounts without a court order, among other measures. I spoke to Daniel the other day, who's now afraid to donate to any charity, and he's now afraid his bank account may be frozen and he will not be able to pay his mortgage. He wonders if these new powers will continue to be used for other causes raising funds if the government does not agree with their values. And Madam Speaker, he's a proud Canadian with 3 flags in his yard, all Canadian flags. From this government, Madam Speaker, we've seen travel restricted, cell phone data collected, military propaganda used domestically, bank accounts frozen, and now the Emergencies Act invoked. My colleagues, if this is not multiple infringements upon civil liberties and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms of Canadians, what is? Canada is now at a crossroads with its democracy. We have a Prime Minister who chooses to vilify, stigmatize, and traumatize Canadians with differing opinions. They have declared a public order emergency with the disagreement of 7 of 10 premiers, and indeed the vast majority of our country outside of Ottawa has no evidence of a public order emergency. We have seen law enforcement agencies successfully deal with the frustrations that have boiled over at the Ambassador Bridge and a multitude of other border crossings without the Emergencies Act. We've also heard about the massive disruptions these blockades and border crossings have caused and damaged our economy. However, I can't fathom that the finance minister tells us how great the economy is at the current time, despite our 5.1% inflation rate and Canadians being priced out of their own lives, all of which were in existence before the last 3 weeks. There is absolutely no reason the Emergencies Act cannot be rescinded post-haste and the madness stopped. And it is sad that an ideological coalition has the potential to allow the act to continue for up to another 30 days. Madam Speaker, the left wing thinks that their position is perfectly fine, and there's no issue with that. These people who wanted to protest were ignored. That is the sad reality of how we ended up here. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, I've found it interesting all day long. I've been hearing Conservatives talk about the need for the Prime Minister to have engaged in dialogue and discussion with the occupiers outside. But yet I find it interesting. Jason Kenney, the Premier of Alberta, didn't engage with the protesters at Coots. Premier Doug Ford didn't engage with the protesters or those that were blocking the bridge at Windsor, in Windsor. And the Premier Stevenson of Manitoba didn't engage with those that were blocking in Manitoba. So my question to the member is quite simple. Does he think that all leadership should engage with the protesters, or just Liberal leadership should engage with protesters?
It's a good member for Cumberland Colchester.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for that question. You know, I think it's fascinating that even the Liberals obviously recognize that the Prime Minister has not spoken or created any dialogue with the protesters. I have to say that I think that is shameful, and it's quite honestly, it's ridiculous. So how that member opposite could possibly say that because somebody else has done something wrong, that continuing to do wrong things make it right? Wow, my mom taught me that when I was a kid.
L'honorable député de Berthier-Masquinongé.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Écoutez, j'ai écouté le discours de mon honorable collègue qui fait quand même la démonstration que le gouvernement avait très peu, ou en tout cas absolument rien fait, avant de déclarer les mesures d'urgence. Et ça donne l'impression que, dans le fond, cette déclaration des mesures d'urgence est une façon qu'on a trouvé d'essayer de sauver la face de ce gouvernement et de ce premier ministre qui faisait absolument rien depuis une vingtaine de jours. J'aimerais avoir l'impression de mon collègue là-dessus. Merci.
For Cumberland Colchester.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague for that question, and I thank the bloc for understanding the untenable situation that we're in and the ridiculous nature of using this act. You know, it's very clear that this Prime Minister is attempting to save the approval ratings, which are dismal at the current time and will continue to fall as Canadians realize that he does not represent the true nature of what it is to be a Canadian. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Honourable Member for Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to my colleague. I've said it before, and I'll reiterate it again. It should have never come down to this. The occupiers that have held downtown Ottawa hostage for weeks made it clear that this was their intentions from the onset. Yet this government did nothing. The member opposite may agree that instead of showing clear and strong leadership on a path forward, the Prime Minister was missing in action. Now here we are. We have rolled out a red carpet for those who feel it reasonable to overthrow our democratic system. This is an occupation fueled by hate and disguised as a peaceful protest. Does the member agree now is the time for action?
For Cumberland Colchester.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank the member for her question. You know, I agree with everything up to the point where, you know, she talked about that the Prime Minister done absolutely nothing. That's obviously patently true. So that point is really important. the difficulty here is, as I pointed out in my speech, Madam Speaker, how did we get here? We got here because of this terrible, unbelievably poor leadership. And if we didn't have that, then we would not have had to come here. To me, I guess I'm concerned that perhaps this pathway was as planned out by this Prime Minister as was the protest.
Member for Ranford-Nipissing, Pembroke.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. To my colleague, given that the Deputy Prime Minister, the Prime Minister in waiting, has opined that she would like to make permanent aspects of the Emergency Act, such as the expansion of FinTrack over more control of people's bank accounts and transactions, and given that the thresholds were not met to invoke the Emergency Act, does he think that perhaps the reason for invoking the Act was to have some expanded, broadened powers permanently, and that was the true goal of casting the country into this situation?
Honourable Member for Cumberland, Colchester.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. And certainly, as I just mentioned previously, that is a concern that I would have as a concerned Canadian citizen to say, what if you're a leader and you do nothing and you end up then with a ham-fisted approach, what was that perhaps your whole raison d'etre from the very beginning? I think that's very possible. I think that Canadians not only want the Liberals off of our back, but we also want them out of our pocketbook as well.
Resuming debate, reprise du débat.